I grew up in a pretty poor household. When you grow up poor, you learn not to waste anything or take anything for granted. At least that's what I tell my wife, who's constantly nagging me to take care of my hoarding issues. Certain habits followed me even as I became an adult with a steady job. I still make sure to squeeze the last bit of toothpaste from the tube. I tend to ignore the expiration dates on my aspirin and Benadryl. And I still try to solve all my problems with duct tape that I dug out from the bins of a nearby hardware store. That of course won't clean up the garage full of junk that I have, as Gina calls it. People think that dumpster diving is shameful or embarrassing, but that couldn't be further from the truth. I learned very quickly from a young age that people are inherently wasteful. Grocery stores throw out products that are close to their expiration dates. College move-out dates are treasure troves for TVs and organizer bins. I've accidentally come across rare jewelry from yard sales where families were tossing their dead grandmother's belongings. You get the picture. Just as a disclaimer, not everything you find in a dumpster is edible or even viable. Sometimes you get moldy fruit, blackened veggies, slightly opened bags of chips, mattresses with bed bugs, furniture beyond repair, and you really just have to let those go. You eventually learn to differentiate between one man's trash and another man's treasure. But some things you find in dumpsters and on the streets have inexplicable origins. I found some weird things in dumpsters that I've saved over the years and forgot about until recently. Now, as I clean my garage up, I want to share some of these strange knickknacks that I've accumulated over the years, because I feel like this place would appreciate them. I'll start with something that gave me nightmares for a week. Gina forced me into the garage and told me that she wouldn't let me back into the house until at least a corner of the garage was completely Marie Kondo'd. Looking at the messy, cluttered garage, it gave me a headache, but I suppose it was a headache that I started. I'll admit, I do have a hoarding problem, and it was only made worse by years of accumulating things from various dumpster dives. I sifted through boxes and boxes of baseball cards, old sneakers, rollerblades, and raggedy clothes, all the while asking myself if any of these items brought me joy. The answer was no. Most of the items were pretty much junk that I thought would be useful at some point. After a few hours of sorting through stuff, I finally happened across something interesting. At the very bottom of the pile was an old vintage Polaroid camera, in its original packaging and everything. This one brought up a lot of memories. My first girlfriend, Sally Herman, my first kiss, and my first breakup. I found this in '06 in a dumpster bin behind a local camera store. I snuck behind the store to scour through its bins out of sheer boredom and curiosity, and seemingly hit gold. Nestled in between black garbage bags was this Polaroid camera. It looked to be in good condition and was in its original packaging and everything. I figured this would be a nice birthday gift for Sally, who just so happened to be getting into photography at the time. To put the icing on top too, a bunch of new film was tossed right next to the Polaroid. It was perfect, or so I had thought. Sally was ecstatic. She had been wanting a nice Polaroid for a long time. She didn't need to know that I basically got it for free. She wanted to use it right away, so we drove to a nearby beach to take some nice pictures. "Charlie, look here." Sally quickly snapped a picture of me while the cold beach water lapped at my feet. "I wasn't ready," I laughed. She pulled the film from the slot and began to shake it. "Take some of me," she demanded, pushing the camera into my hands. I snapped a few photos of her, with the ocean in the background. We took random pictures of the scenery. We even turned the camera and tried to squeeze into the small frame and take one together. This was a time before iPhones and selfies became ubiquitous, so we had to be creative. It would have been a great day, had the film not given us issues. "They're not developing." Sally's eyebrows scrunched up as she continued to shake the film, Give it a few seconds. I heard you're not supposed to shake it, I said. You're supposed to keep it away from light. Tuck it under your armpit. Oh, Sally muttered as she put the Polaroid between her armpits awkwardly. We stood in silence for a moment before she shook it out again, only to be disappointed by the blank film. That's so weird. I brought the Polaroid closer to my face to examine it. It certainly seemed flawless, aside from the dented box that I had found it in. Maybe there was something wrong with it after all. It looks like it's faulty merchandise. Where did you get this from? Sally asked. Maybe we can return it. Oh, you know, the camera store in the corner of Main and Maple. Oh, you mean Fred's Cameras and Imaging? Sally seemed confused. Charlie, that place closed down a few months ago. Huh? No way, I was there just yesterday. Yeah, Fred and my dad are buddies. He had to close the shop because of the rat infestation from the Italian place right next door. It's pretty much just an empty storefront. After a long conversation, Sally figured out that I didn't, in fact, purchase this camera, and I was forced to admit that I had found it in a garbage bin behind the store. I lost my first girlfriend that day and a bit of my pride, but I gained a broken camera and the useful knowledge of never re-gifting dumpster finds to a girl ever again. The strangest thing was, I distinctly remembered seeing someone behind the cash register through the glass windows of the store. It wasn't Fred, but there was definitely someone there, and the store didn't look empty at all. In fact, it looked like it was still in business. I remembered that I had to be sneaky about going to the bins behind the store because I didn't want to be caught. But when I went back later that day, the store was indeed empty, and the bins were completely barren as well. And that was quite an unwanted trip down memory lane. I sighed as I dug through the Polaroid box for those pictures. After that disastrous date, I had stashed the Polaroid and the blank films into the box and I shoved it where the light didn't shine. I never wanted to look at them again, but figured I may as well try to check if they had magically developed over the years. Give myself something to laugh about and cringe over. The films weren't blank anymore. I did a double take, confused as all heck as I scanned the films. I knew my memory wasn't failing me. These films were blank when we had checked in the beach, and they were most definitely blank when I shoved them into the box all those years ago. They were faded and dusty, but they were reminiscent of the pictures we took that day. The picture of me being caught off guard, pictures of Sally posing, the selfie of us, but they just weren't quite right. There was no ocean in the background, and in fact, it didn't seem like we were at the beach at all. Instead, the film showed us something strange. The picture of me caught off guard seemed blurred out, and all you could see was a vague silhouette against a hazy, burgundy-red background, almost like a sunset, even though we were at the beach on a sunny afternoon. I would have chalked it up to faulty film if it weren't for the fact that as each single shot of Sally progressed, her facial expressions began to look increasingly concerned. I distinctly remember her laughing for the photos, and the concerned expressions on her face in the photographs were beginning to send chills down my back. The selfie of us was more focused on a frowning Sally, with my face blurred out into the side. All of the pictures were definitely from that day, yet they also weren't at the same time. I grabbed the Polaroid, turning it around to examine it from different angles. It looked just as new as it did when I had given it to Sally, save for the dust that had accumulated on the surface. I peered into the lens, shook it around a bit, opened the battery compartment. Nothing had changed. I pressed the button on the Polaroid in an attempt to see if it still worked. To my surprise, it actually began to print out a picture. But before I could put it down, more pictures suddenly spat out of the camera. I struggled to keep the pictures from haphazardly scattering across the floor as the Polaroid rapid spat out photograph after photograph. I figured maybe the camera was backed up on photos, if that was even possible, but after all this time when no one had used it in years, The camera seemed to be on an auto capture mode as it finally spent the last of its film, as I heard a strange winding down sound. The camera then shut down. I tried pressing the button again, but nothing happened. The pictures began to develop in my hands, and I held my breath as I saw what formed on the little square films. All the pictures involved Sally in some way or another. I tried my best to arrange the photographs in the way that they were spat out. The first few films seemed relatively innocuous for a camera that just randomly spat out pictures that I didn't take. They were all of Sally, but from perspectives that suggested she wasn't aware of the photographs being taken. One was of Sally at her college graduation, talking to her friends. Another was of Sally waiting for the bus and staring off into the streets. Another showed Sally playing baseball from a strange angle. And another was of Sally checking the mail in front of her childhood home. She looked somewhat upset and bothered in each photo. I immediately felt sick as I realized she wasn't aware in any of these photos that she was being photographed. It felt as though I was stalking her in some way. The next film showed a long, winding road with what looked like an older Sally standing in the middle of a long, barren road, again pressed against a hazy red background. Her facial expression was indecipherable. The next few films after that showed a cornfield, an eerie shot of a scarecrow, and a broken down shed with a decrepit windmill looming next to it. There were only a few films to check after that. Even though I felt that something was terribly wrong, I pressed on, and I really wished that I hadn't. The 9th film showed Sally sleeping on what looked like a haystack, with her hands and feet tied up in her mouth, gagged with cloth. The 10th showed her awake and terrified, the flash of the Polaroid illuminating her features and accentuating her horrified eyes. As I got closer to the end, the photos became more and more erratic, with strange and shaky blurred angles that suggested a struggle. The 13th and final film was what terrified me the most. The face of a washed-out man peered into the lens of the camera. A set of hollow eyes and a bulbous nose looked back at me from a strange angle that suggested whoever was behind the camera was taking a picture of himself. But his eyes seemed to go beyond the frame of the photograph, and they peered into my own, as if he was examining me, watching me and studying me. I threw the Polaroid down on the floor and immediately pulled out my phone to look up Sally on Facebook. With shaky hands, I scrolled through various Sally Hermans until I found one who remotely looked like Sally as an older woman. If what the pictures had suggested was even remotely reflected of reality, she was in trouble. After I had moved away from my small town and started a family of my own, I fell out of contact with almost all my old friends. As such, I had no idea what was going on with their lives. I decided this was worth reconnecting with an ex-girlfriend over, to try and figure out what these photographs were about, and to make sure that she was okay. There were definitely sinister forces at play here. What I wasn't expecting, however, was for her Facebook profile to read, "Remembering Sally Herman." Countless posts littered her Facebook wall saying things like, "You will be missed forever," and "Rest in peace." Pictures of her and her friends smiling at graduation, of her playing baseball with her teammates, of her with a boyfriend in front of a cafe near a bus station, and her in front of her childhood home with her brother were displayed. This was most definitely Sally, and if it was, then the worst case scenario had already happened. I began scouring the post for any hints of what had happened. Was it a disease, a freak accident, self-inflicted? I turned to Google for the answer that I was so afraid to come to terms with. Sure enough, there was an obituary for Sally in various news articles about how she had gone missing one day, only to have turned up in an abandoned shack in the middle of nowhere. It was clearly ruled out as her doing it to herself and labeled as a homicide. They had found her in a body bag, with absolutely no signs of blunt force trauma, suffocation, or any sign of a typical murder. Authorities suggested that she may have died of shock or a poison that didn't turn up in the autopsy report. The article stated that the perpetrator was still on the loose and that any evidence that could lead to the capture of the murderer would be rewarded with a hefty sum of money. I shut my phone off and shoved it back into my pocket, immediately leaving the garage and the Polaroids on the floor. I needed to gather myself and process everything that I had just seen. The shack that Sally was found in looked exactly like the one in the Polaroid, next to the windmill that was falling apart. A picture of the road directly aligned with the Polaroid that I had. Anybody with half a brain would have pinned the blame on me for having such questionable photos of Sally in the first place, and I would have had no actual, substantive explanation to give them. No one would have believed my story. I knew that I had stumbled across something I wasn't supposed to see, and I also knew that I had to get rid of everything. I dang near had a heart attack when I went back to the garage. My wife was picking the Polaroids off the floor, grumbling about how she always does everything in the house. I attempted to explain what they were and what had happened in the time she was gone. Gina looked confused, only stopping me to ask why I was freaking out over a bunch of blank Polaroid films. Sure enough, when she handed me the Polaroids, all the films seemed to be wiped clean of everything that I saw. And look, I know that I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. I trust my memory. Which is why when Gina asked if she could keep the vintage camera, I said no and immediately threw it out. I wish I could say that was the weirdest thing that I found, but there have certainly been weirder things that I've come across. In the meantime, if you're going to dumpster dive, be careful and be picky. You never know what you'll find. A lot of memories that I had repressed seem to be resurfacing as I clean up my garage. I could go into detail about the rocking chair that rocks on its own, or the Furby that I picked up from a yard sale that is most definitely haunted. But today I'm going to be telling you about a strange television I found back in my college years. I mentioned in my last post that college move-out dates are a godsend for dumpster diving, and I stand by that. I used to room near a wealthy private university that rhymes with kale, where students are either secured by trust funds or incredibly intelligent. I witnessed my fair share of entitled, wealthy 20-something-year-olds casually throwing out mini-fridges, vacuums, and televisions right onto the curbside for the garbage men to pick up. Fun fact, over the years, I've amassed a collection of mini-fridges currently sitting in my basement, each stocked with a different brand of beer. It's probably the best thing that I own. Plus, the Dyson vacuum cleaner I picked up from a sorority mansion still works perfectly well. Now, I didn't go to this particular university mostly because I couldn't afford it even if I was smart enough to get in, and also because I was definitely not smart enough to get in. But I did go to a pretty decent state school nearby where I roomed with 3 different guys in a house specifically set aside for student living. Reggie, Max, and Jake were my roommates all throughout college because we happened to click pretty well. The 3 of us had similar interests, similar majors, and similar irregular sleep schedules. I'm proud to say that I was the one who introduced them to dumpster diving, and the rest was pretty much history. And we still make an effort to hang out almost every year. Every summer, the rich kids would dump a bunch of stuff outside, and so we spent those warm summer nights combing through the streets and loading up Reggie's pickup truck with microwaves, dressers, storage bins, and futons. Sorority houses were good targets for things like Palm Pilots and butterfly chairs. Frat houses supplied boom boxes and Walkmans. We had no shame in absolutely all the time in the world. We would head to the campus dorms in the middle of the night to grab the discarded frozen foods in the dumpsters behind the dorms. The amount of microwavable food thrown out by wasteful college kids was enough to feed a small village. We managed to survive off frozen veggies, instant rice, Eggo waffles, Totinos, and Hot Pockets for a month. Our house was a strange amalgamation of various things that we had picked up from these streets and the bins, but we made it work and we had a good time doing it. Of course, not everything we picked up was good, and the television was a prime example. It was a hot day in August and we were vegging out on the couch. We were stoned out of our minds and munching down on some pizza rolls and Snickers that we found in the bin of an Aldi's when Reggie burst through the front door. "Kappa Psi has a TV outside their house," he yelled. "Oh crap." We were tired of watching TV through the tiny retro TV we found at the dumpster of an electronics store, and none of us were truly satisfied with the grainy quality of the TV. We looked all summer for a decent television, but in that particular summer, the TV supply went dry. Luckily, Reggie had spotted the TV on his way back from his shift at Sonic, but it was too big for him to load up by himself. Back in those days, TVs were bulky and heavy. Flat screens weren't really a thing yet. I, the most sober between me, Jake, and Max, clambered into Reggie's truck and accompanied him to the Kappa Psi house, where the television sat gloriously on the curb, as if it was waiting for us. We had struck gold, or so we thought. As we struggled to load the TV into the back of Reggie's truck, a brother from the house came out, holding a can of beer and looking confused. "You guys need help?" he called, leaning against the porch railing. Reggie and I looked at each other, but I was too blazed to come up with a response. "We're good, I think." "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. Saw you guys taking the TV and figured if you were going to take it, you might as well take the remote too." "All good, dude. Actually, while you're here, do you know if this thing even works?" I asked, tapping the screen. "I mean, yeah, it still works, but apparently it's a little wonky." The brother shrugged, fishing the remote from his pocket. One of the brothers insisted that we just toss it out. "What's wrong with the TV?" Reggie asked. "I'm not really sure. It honestly seems fine to me. All I know is the guy who owned it said the crap was haunted, and then he dropped out of school to check himself into a psych ward. But hey, it's all yours if you want it." With that, he tossed us the remote that went to the TV and went back inside. We glanced at each other for a moment, shrugged and loaded the TV onto the car. "What do you think he meant by wonky?" Reggie wondered as we drove off. "And a psych ward. Really?" The guy probably watched a horror movie and it was too much for his fragile, sheltered brain. You know, Kappa Psi is full of dumb rich kids. I really didn't care about the guy's warning. All my stoned primal mind could think of was free TV. We spent a good hour hooking up the TV to the corner, trying to make sense of the wires and the cables. But we were finally able to get a picture on the screen after struggling for a bit, and it was glorious. A good colored picture was hard to come by in those days, so this was a huge win. I went to the microwave to make more munchies while Max, Reggie, and Jake fiddled with the TV. "Man, this TV has so many channels," Max said, flipping through various shows and static. The lower numbered channels were your typical news channels and sitcoms. As the channels went higher and higher, the shows became more and more unfamiliar. We caught glimpses of Spanish soap operas, auctions, infomercials, and Asian reality shows. But then something strange happened. Without warning, the channel numbers skipped from the 150s to the 400s. Confused, we continued to surf through various staticky channels until we got to channel 444. It just so happened to be airing The Joy of Painting in what was considered a full HD at the time. But something was off. A man took a seat in front of the canvas, surrounded by a pitch-black background. He looked like Bob Ross. He had the afro, the beard, faded jeans, and the blue button-down. But when he turned to face the camera, you could tell that he was clearly not Bob. He donned the classic Bob Ross perma-smile as he began to mix the paint on his palette, slowly wiggling the brush around. The only colors on his palette were various shades of red and a blob of black paint. Soothing music filled the background. "Welcome to the joy of painting, where none of us are mistakes," he muttered. He had a vague accent. "Just happy little accidents." The man began to paint, but the scenery that he was painting was not at all serene. Instead of the peaceful orange sunset that he was using as a reference, he began to draw an unhappy face in blood-red paint. "I don't want to draw a sunset today. Sometimes we don't have to draw what's expected of us, he mused. Sometimes we can draw whatever we want. Since when was Bob Ross like that? I asked, shocked at the sudden change of tone. Everyone shrugged. Use absolutely no pressure, he said, just like an angel's wing. Well, where was that when I was young, father? Where? The man's smile and volume reached an uncomfortable intensity as he began grinding his teeth to the point where his gums began to bleed. You can do anything you want in this world. Artists are allowed to be different. That's what he said. Once you help everyone around you get what they want, isn't that right? Isn't that right? His painting became increasingly erratic, and the pressure on the brush increased. The bristles on the brush began to break down as fake Bob smashed it against the canvas, with no care for the end result. I helped everyone in my life. They said we want happy paintings, we want sad things. Watch the news. Well, I watched the news and I didn't like it. Not at all. The fake Bob screamed, crying and hyperventilating. The painting was no longer reminiscent of anything remotely close to a sunset. It was a haphazard mess of erratic brushstrokes and madness. You could see the whites of fake Bob's knuckles as he mashed the brush under the bristles spread out into a messy fan. The chaotic scene finally climaxed into fake Bob throwing his palette to the canvas and smearing it across the canvas, creating an ugly, angry mess of black and red. You can do anything you want to do. This is your world, fake Bob whispered, a mess of tears and snot as he tossed the palette and he marched off screen. Either we're smoking some weird stuff or that's not Bob Ross, Jake blinked, sufficiently freaked out. You all saw that, right? That's not Bob Ross, idiot. Max rolled his eyes as he pressed the button on the TV to skip to channel 445. Probably just an independent movie with some type of message. I don't know. In any case, the dude's got issues, Reggie remarked, clearly a little freaked out. The next channel featured what looked like a grayscale Barney and Friends, if Barney suffered from serious budget cuts. In fact, this didn't look like a typical episode at all. A man in a dirty, beat-up Barney mascot costume sat on a bench, lighting a cigarette between his purple paws. The show then cut to a shot of a group of children walking up to Barney holding their arms out. As if this wasn't unsettling enough, a simple camera zoom showed that the children weren't kids at all. They were short adults dressed up in children's clothing, hairstyled in pigtails and bowl cuts to resemble the children on the set of Barney. They all looked exhausted and terrified. The background music constituted of 2 piano notes being played on repeat. Barney hugged each of them one by one. Hello, children, he said. The voice was exactly the same as the voice of fake Bob Ross. Hi, Barney. They all mused in unison. A woman in braids and a frayed pink dress was the last one to approach Barney, arms visibly bruised and shaking. The rest of the children stood silently in a line behind Barney. What are we learning today, Mr. Barney? She asked, voice low and trembling. I noticed that she also had a vague accent. The Barney took off his mask, revealing the same man who was playing Bob Ross in the earlier channel. The man looked more haggard this time, no afro and beard. A 5 o'clock shadow replaced the Bob Ross beard, and a receding hairline replaced the afro. He took a long drag from his cigarette before putting the butt out on the girl's arm. Today, we're learning about manners, fake Barney replied as the girl winced. It is good manners for a woman to never complain, like Natalia here. Natalia is a good girl because she listens to Barney and does not whine like other women do. He put the head of Barney back on, and the music suddenly changed to a more joyful arrangement as he led the children to a playground for their lesson. One man, however, did not follow the rest of the group. Barney turned slowly, watching Dimitri fidget in place. Dimitri, what are you doing? Barney asked, voice gruff and impatient. "Come here." "I can't do this anymore," Dimitri said, and he began going off on a rant. The other children looked shocked and huddled together as Barney walked towards them. Barney put his paws on Dimitri's shoulder. Dimitri flinched. "This was not a part of the deal, Dimitri. You're being a bad friend." Dimitri shook his head and admonished fake Barney in Russian. Barney shook his head as if he couldn't believe what was going on. He shushed Dimitri by caressing his face and his paws, saying something back in Russian, and then he slapped him across the face. Dimitri fell to the floor and Barney reached into his costume and pulled out a revolver. It all happened so quickly. Before we could even react, the camera quickly cut to the horrified expression of the other children as we heard multiple gunshots go off. By the time the gunshots stopped, the camera had cut back to Dimitri, who is now depicted as a blow-up doll with multiple bullet holes, dressed in Dimitri's clothing and surrounded by a pool of red. "What the actual heck?" I exclaimed, and I heard Reggie whimper. "I changed my mind. Today's lesson will be about obedience and being a good friend," Barney said joyfully. "Bad friends who do not obey good friends who help them will never make it far in life." We should have just shut off the TV then and there, but the TV wouldn't let us turn it off. Max left the room muttering about how he needed to find a new weed dealer. Jake covered his eyes and groaned about how he was scarred for life. Reggie and I tried to manually turn the TV off, but it wouldn't budge, let alone change channels. The sobbing cast began to tentatively sing and dance to the classic Barney and Friends "I Love You, You Love Me" ending song, but in Russian. As they approached the end of the song, the scene abruptly cut to a circle of blow-up dolls vaguely dressed up in the children's clothing and wigs, lying on the floor with abandon. The Barney kicked around the blow-up dolls for a moment before crawling close to the camera, purple mask filling up the frame. "And remember, friends," Fake Barney said, beady mask eyes looking directly into the camera, "I love you." We desperately tried to change the channel, hoping to go back down to PBS documentaries and ABC sitcoms, but the TV wouldn't let us go down. With every click of the remote, the channels only went up and up, each channel featuring the same man every time, parodying famous sitcoms and movies. We saw the man drowning in a kiddie pool as Jack from Titanic, holding the hand of a blow-up doll meant to be Rose. The same man posed as a news anchor in a disheveled suit and messy wig, reporting on what looked to be the Chernobyl nuclear incident. There was a Sesame Street-esque show where dirty sock puppets with googly eyes seemed to be reciting random Russian words in unison. There was even a Christmas movie parody, with the man painted completely in green and acting as the Grinch. Each channel that followed became increasingly unsettling, if that was even possible. But the last channel was probably the worst of all. And just when we thought there was no end in sight, the TV would not let the channels go any higher. The actor was staring directly into our eyes, wearing an all-black bodysuit that covered the tip of his forehead all the way down to his toes. "You do not enjoy my performances," he lamented. "But why?" "Is he talking to us?" Jake whisper yelled. "Oh, of course it's channel 666, Reggie sighed. "Why wouldn't it be?" "You change the channel, you try to turn off the TV, even though I try so hard to entertain you. You are rude. I know you watch and I know you see me." We sat in silence as the man went off on an angry Russian rant. We didn't know what to do at this point. The TV wouldn't turn off and the channels wouldn't cooperate either. We felt somewhat entranced by this strange Russian man putting on a one-man show. "Even if you ignore me, I'll be heard. I will not be silenced. I will be seen." With that, he reached his lanky fingers to his face where he began to pull on his bottom eyelids. He stretched out his eyelids until they began to rip from his face, groaning and sobbing the entire time. his tears mixed in with the red pouring out from his eyes. His long dirty fingernails tore his face apart, revealing the muscles and even bone underneath. Jake started yelling obscenities as he fruitlessly tried to turn off the TV. "Is this enough for you? Is it?" he wailed as he grabbed a knife off screen. But before we could watch what he was going to do with it, Max emerged from his room and threw his old boombox at the television. The TV sparked a few times, static filling the screen, until it finally conked out. A crack filled the corner of the TV where the boombox hit it. The man's agonized screams broke up as the screen finally became black and everything was silent. We all looked at each other, jaws dropped and eyes wide with fear. We had literally just witnessed a man rip his face off, and if it weren't for Max, we may have been witnesses to an actual killing. We sat in total silence, trying to digest everything that we had just seen. "Any chance that was fake?" Reggie asked softly, breaking the silence. "I don't know, but I know for a fact that I'm never smoking again," Jake declared. The next day, everything seemed to be back to normal. The television started to play regular channels again, albeit with a visible crack. We were overly cautious with the TV afterwards, never going beyond Channel 15 in fear of being transported to those weird channels again. As for what happened afterwards, we actually ended up becoming the source of one of the most infamous urban legends in the college, the owners of the weird TV from Kappa Psi. Sure, we were traumatized for a while, but at the very least, we had an interesting story to tell at parties, and the quality of the TV was way too good to pass up. And yeah, any normal person would have thrown the TV away, but we pretty much only had about 3 brain cells between the 4 of us and figured what had happened was a one-time thing that would never happen again. And luckily, we were right. We continued to use the TV throughout our college years, and that man never appeared ever again, nor did any of his freaky knockoff shows. And we even managed to find a cheap DVD player at a thrift store that we hooked up to the TV. But I could definitely see why the original owner of the TV dropped out of school and checked into a ward. As we graduated and all of us went our separate ways, we debated tossing the TV or saddling it with one of us. I volunteered to keep the TV for memory's sake, and I took it with me. The TV was then buried under hockey sticks and old blankets in the corner of my garage. I had pushed most of my college years out of my brain, but the memories of that summer night came flooding back once I laid eyes on the cracked screen. I dragged the TV out from the corner to throw it out. It was still as gargantuan and cracked as it was in college. I half expected it to turn on and start playing those weird shows again, but nothing like that happened. As I pushed the TV out onto the curbside, I hoped no one but the garbage truck would try and grab this haunted TV from the early 2000s from the sidewalk. Out of sheer curiosity, I decided to hit up my old roommates about the television for old time's sake. I texted them a picture of the TV on the sidewalk as I walked back into the house, captioned, "Finally throwing this thing out." I didn't check on my phone until after dinner that night, but when I opened my phone, I was flooded with worried messages from the boys, telling me to look closely at the picture that I had sent. In the corner of the screen of the TV, I could just barely make out the silhouette of a pale man in a black bodysuit, the same bodysuit that the man wore as he tore his face apart. I immediately ran out to check on the TV, but it was no longer on the sidewalk where I had left it. My older brother Ernie came over the other day. He's the one who introduced me to dumpster diving. Ernie is currently in the process of moving to a new apartment, but he had a bunch of stuff from my childhood that he felt was too sentimental to throw out, so naturally he felt compelled to bring them over. And Gina wasn't too thrilled about Ernie bringing another box of junk into our lives. On the other hand, our 5-year-old daughter, Cece, was delighted by the contents. "What's this egg-looking thing, Uncle Ernie?" Cece had asked, holding up an old Tamagotchi from the box. When we were in grade school, Ernie and I had scored big on a bunch of defective Tamagotchis tossed in the garbage bins behind a Toys R Us. As it turns out, the only defective thing about them were the damaged packaging they came in, and we managed to resell them at school for a hefty price. It's called a Tamagotchi, Cece. Ernie clicked on one of the 3 tiny buttons, bringing it back to life. It's a digital pet that you can feed and raise and clean up after. Oh, a pet. Cece looked delighted, and then immediately reverted her expression into a sad puppy dog face. Mommy and Daddy won't buy me a pet doggy because they said I'm too little. Don't try to swindle Uncle Ernie into getting you a dog, sweetie. It's a huge responsibility. Gina chuckled, ruffling Cece's hair. Maybe if you take good care of your Tamagotchi, your daddy and I will consider getting you a doggy. Cece leaped with joy, fiddling with the buttons. After a few minutes of beeping, she lost interest, tossed the Tamagotchi aside, and continued rummaging through the box. I'm surprised that thing still works. Ernie scrunched up his nose. Are we really getting that old? Kids don't know what Tamagotchis are anymore. You're 40, Ernie. You are old. I rolled my eyes. Hey, you're not that far behind. Ernie scoffed. It's Mr. Potato Head. Cece giggled, grabbing the old toy from the box. Mr. Potato Head was in serious need of facial implantation. Everything but one eye and a nose was gone. Where's his face? Where's Woody and Buzz? How does she know what that is? Ernie asked, genuinely surprised. Didn't Toy Story come out in the 90s? Toy Story 4 came out a couple years ago, so we had to watch the entire franchise with her, Gina explained. There's a Toy Story 4? God, Ernie, you're really out of touch, aren't you? I chuckled. Hey, if I wanted to get hitched and have a kid, I would have done so by now. Ernie hopped defensively. Besides, I'm a good enough uncle. Cece's having a great time with the stuff that I brought. I mean, just look at her. Cece had managed to get her hair tangled within the confines of a slinky toy. She cried loudly as Gina tried to untangle her. Good times, huh? Ernie mused. Yeah, it's crazy how we found all of these things in the trash. I bent over and peered inside the box. I sifted through my old Beyblade collection, scattered Yu-Gi-Oh cards, a broken eye dog, a beaten-up pair of Heelys with the wheels missing, and an old iPod shuffle. There were also unopened cases of knockoff Barbie dolls and Bratz dolls in the mix that we found in a bin of a Kmart. Weren't we going to sell these off to the girls at school? And use the money to buy a Game Boy? Heck yeah, Ernie nodded. But no girl at school wanted fake Barbies. I doubt Cece would want them either. Wait, Ern, do you remember these things? At the bottom of the box were 2 old yellow walkie-talkies. They were a bit beaten up and gunky from age, but they were surprisingly functional. They weren't your typical colorful Walmart-grade toy walkie-talkies, but they weren't quite military-grade either. That's some insane battery life right there, I mumbled as I played with the channels. I handed the other walkie-talkie over to my brother, who took it over to the other side of the living room. This is Alpha Team reporting from the living room. It's a war zone in here. Charlie, can you hear me? Hoorah, over. I can hear you, over, I laughed. This old pair of walkie-talkies cured our boredom on more than a few occasions when we were younger. We found these discarded in the dumpster at the campgrounds that our dad used to take us to in the fall. In fact, we found a lot of stuff in the trash of the campgrounds. Lighters, toothpaste, unopened trail mix, granola bars, and occasionally chocolate bars. Our dad would call us little idiots for going through the trash, but that didn't stop us. We had stopped going a long time ago, but I had fond memories of camping. Why anybody would throw away a perfectly good pair of walkie-talkies, I could never figure out. What's that, Daddy? Cece was finally free from the grips of the slinky toy. She waddled over and stared at the device with intense curiosity. It's called a walkie-talkie, I explained. Back when phones weren't popular yet, people used these to communicate with each other. It's like too many radios that you can talk into. The spies used to use them. Spies? Cece's eyes widened. And police too. Wow, I want to be a spy police. Cece clapped her hands excitedly. You click on the side button when you want to say something, and then you let it go to hear what the other end wants to say. You have to end everything with over so that the other side knows you finished talking, Ernie said, demonstrating how to work the gadget. As the two played with their walkie-talkies, I packed up the rest of our childhood junk. Hope you're not putting that in the garage. Gina eyed the box. I'll go through everything later. Some of these things have real sentimental value, you know. Whatever. As long as it's gone by the end of the week with all the other junk. Gina sighed. If I had known a pair of old garbage walkie-talkies would have kept her this busy, I wouldn't have bought her the Switch. It makes you wonder why we ever stopped using walkie-talkies in the first place. She makes them look so fun. I said, watching Cece and Ernie make random noises through the devices. Maybe because cell phones became a thing, Gina suggested. Good point. For the rest of the night, Cece refused to communicate with us without the walkie-talkie. Everything we wanted to say to her, we would have to say into the walkie-talkie and end it with, over. She eventually grew bored of talking to us and started fiddling with the channels on the device while Ernie and I watched Family Feud. Runaway 1-1. A man's voice came through Cece's walkie-talkie as we set up the couch for Ernie to crash on for the night. All clear for takeoff. Daddy, somebody's trying to talk to me. Stranger danger. Cece screeched, clearly caught off guard. Ernie chuckled. You've just turned into another frequency kid, he said, changing the channel. Sometimes walkie-talkies accidentally tune into different radio waves and you can hear pilots talk to each other. With a walkie-talkie like this, you could probably even hear things like police communications and park rangers if you surf the channels for long enough. I wouldn't encourage it though. You wouldn't want them to know that you're snooping. And I don't want some weirdo figuring out that he's on the same frequency as her. I took the walkie from her. What's a weirdo? Cece asked innocently. Nothing, it's way past your bedtime, young lady. I scolded, ignoring her question. Can I please bring this to my bed? Cece pleaded. She glanced at Ernie, who she knew would take her side. I promise I won't snoop. What's the harm? Ernie shrugged. She has school tomorrow, I sighed. I promise that I'll go to bed. I just want to hold on to this one. You can keep that one. She pointed to the other walkie-talkie lying on the ground, clutching onto her own. All right, but you better not be talking to any strangers with that thing. I picked up a delighted Cece and headed upstairs to tuck her into bed. A sharp static transmission ringing in my ears woke me up abruptly. I groaned and brought the sides of my pillow to my face, way too exhausted to deal with this at 1 a.m. I knew immediately it was the dang walkie-talkie. I should have known better than to trust my daughter to not play around with it. Cece, stop playing with the dang walkie-talkie, I grumbled, rolling over to the walkie-talkie on my nightstand. Over. I heard a childish giggle from the other end, and the noise seemed to stop for a moment. But then the static came online again, buzzing louder and sounding more erratic by the second. Gina was sound asleep next to me. It was a good thing she was a heavy sleeper. Honey, please turn off your walkie-talkie and go to bed. Over. I sighed, but the static didn't stop. I got up, figuring there was an issue. Maybe Cece had left it leaning on the speaker button. Cece, can anyone hear me? My eyes widened. That wasn't Cece's voice. The gruff voice of a man crackled through the walkie-talkie. I shot up in bed. Hello? I whispered into the walkie-talkie. Static crackled through before the same panicked voice spoke up again. Hello. Can anyone hear me? Anyone, I need help. Sir, can you calm down? What's your name? Where are you? I jumped out of bed and ran to my daughter's room, shocked at what I had just heard. I really hoped Cece wasn't listening to something strange on the other end. Luckily, she was sound asleep, walkie-talkie propped up on her nightstand. Her walkie-talkie produced a steady static akin to that of a calm, white noise. Hello? I grabbed both walkie-talkies and ran downstairs to where Ernie was sleeping on the couch. "Ern, wake up." I shook my brother until he turned over. "Is it morning already?" Ernie blinked, groggy and confused. "No, look." I pointed to the walkie-talkies in my hands. "Oh, thank God you can actually hear me. I've been trying to find someone on this frequency for so long. My name is Harold Fisher and I don't know how long I've been here. I went camping with my son George and I haven't been able to reach anyone." "Hang on, who is this? What's going on?" Ernie shook his head, now fully awake. "Is this a prank or something?" "I don't know. I woke up to some giggling and this guy came through my walkie-talkie. I think he's in trouble." I threw my cell at Ernie. "Call 911. Harold, are you still there? We're gonna try and help you. Can you describe your surroundings? Any familiar landmarks? Maybe we can figure out where you are based off that," I suggested. "I know where I am. I'm in the woods, Bull Run Mountain. I just don't know my exact location. I've been walking around in circles forever. No landmarks. The trees all look the same. And I haven't seen the sun in so long. This has been the longest night of my life," Harold replied. "Bull Run Mountain," I muttered. "Bull Run Mountain was where our dad would take us camping when we were younger. It was where we found these walkie-talkies lying in the trash in the first place. We've been there. We know where you are." "The phone's not connecting," Ernie whisper yelled, holding up my phone. Sure enough, the screen read and no service. I waved at him to keep trying. There was no logical reason that we should have lost cell service unless the entire area was out. I just paid the phone bill. "Can you please send someone to find me? Like the police or maybe a search and rescue ranger. I really need to find my son and go home." "We're trying to contact the police now. Until we can do so, I don't know where I'm going. Everything looks the same. I lost my map, my compass. I'm starving. I feel like I haven't slept in days, but it's been nighttime forever now. I'm trying to find the campground again, and I don't know where my son went. I feel like I'm going insane, like my sense of time is gone." The walkie-talkie fizzled out. I smacked it a few times to get it working again. Harold, I called, shaking the walkie-talkie. "I can still hear you," Harold replied after a brief, staticky pause. "I found a clearing that I've never seen before. At least I don't think I have." "All right, we're still trying to call the police. Can you stay put in one place while we try to figure this out?" "I can't stop now. I've got to find George and get home. My wife and daughter, oh God, please let Stephanie know that I'm alive and I'm here. They must be worried sick." "Charlie, your phone's not working and mine isn't either," Ernie said softly. "I don't know what's going on. Maybe our phone lines are down." "Keep trying anyway," I instructed. "Harold, do you have a GPS or anything we can find you with? How did you end up where you are?" "No, I don't have anything. Look, all I know is I took my son on a camping trip. Everything was going great, but then he disappeared from our tent at night. And when I went to look for him, I left all my gear behind like an idiot. I haven't been able to find my way back since, and I don't know where he is at all." "And do you see any stars in the sky?" I was really grasping at straws here. Maybe he could position himself using the stars as a guide. Big Dipper, Little Dipper, anything. "I see stars, but they're weird." "Weird?" "I don't like looking at them. There's something off about them. They're too straight," Harold said. "And the moon too, it's weird. It looks so fake. Too big and bright. Everything looks so off here." I was out of ideas. I looked desperately at Ernie, who was still trying to dial 911 at any cost. "And have you run into anyone else?" I asked. "It's just been me and the trees. No people, no animals. I would honestly hug a bear right now if it came up to me. At least I would know that I'm not alone. Can you tell me the date that you got there? You had to get a permit to camp, right? And we could probably alert the rangers." "Good idea. Yeah, Harold paused. "I think it was September 6th. September, it's February. Ernie scrunched his eyebrows. He's been there for 6 months. What are you talking about? I asked. Did you mean February 6th? No, September 6th, 1995. 1995? I was incredulous. Sir, you must be mistaken, it's 2021. Wait, I think I see someone. Harold's breath started picking up. At the same time, the walkie-talkie I grabbed from Cece's room stopped giving off the static sound. Hee hee hee. The same childlike giggle that woke me up came through the speaker of Cece's walkie-talkie, but this time the giggle seemed to be on an eerie loop. I think I see a child. I think that's George. Harold sounded delighted. That's my son. I found my son. Hide and seek, hide and seek. The child's voice chanted from the other walkie-talkie. Crap. Ernie threw his phone to the ground and grabbed the walkie-talkie from my hand. We had the unanimous feeling that whoever Harold was seeing, it wasn't his son. Harold, don't go towards the child, Ernie warned, but it was of no use. The fact that we could still hear Harold meant that he had not let go of the speaker on his end. He probably wasn't hearing a thing from our end though. Oh God, Harold stammered. That's not. He began to break down. My son, he's hanging from the tree. By his neck, he's just hanging there. It's his skin, just his skin. Everything's so flat and oh, his eyes are just gone. They're empty. Harold, please. Whatever you're seeing, it's not. Why? Why is he just hanging there? Who put my son there? Harold wailed. Who? Sir, George, oh Christ, how is he moving? Why is he smiling? A loud screech ripped through both speakers of the walkie-talkies. We winced in pain, dropping them instinctively. The screech died down gradually, being replaced by total and complete silence, until a clear voice, devoid of any static interference, flowed through both speakers. Found you! The child's voice giggled. Something's coming out of his skin. I heard Harold scream and begin to make a mad dash across the forest. The sound of the crunching of leaves beneath him was only overpowered by his heavy breathing and wheezing. I could hear Harold as clear as day now, and it was as if I was listening to Harold running in surround sound and not through 2 old walkie-talkies. And he wasn't alone anymore. I could also hear a child maniacally laughing in the background. Whatever he had found in the tree, it was now following him through the forest, and we couldn't do anything about it. I heard him suddenly gasp at the distinct sound of a tumble and a sickening crunch following immediately. My ankle, Harold sobbed. Any hope he ever had left his voice. It has my ankle. I can't call anyone, Ernie yelled. The phones are completely down. No, please don't. Help me, Harold screamed. It sounded as though he was crawling at this point, desperate to escape whatever was chasing him. Harold, can you still hear us? Can you? But subconsciously, I knew I was calling out in vain. Something told me that I wasn't going to hear from Harold anymore. I heard a final thud, the sound of his horrified scream being cut off, and then total complete silence once more. Ernie and I sat holding our breaths. We looked at each other unsure what to do. The walkie-talkie stared quietly back to us. Minutes passed, but we didn't have to wait long to figure out what our next moves were, because the low, gruff voice of Harold came through the speakers, clear as water. You're it. Heck no, I'm not taking any chances with this stuff. Ernie grabbed the walkie-talkies and ran to the garage. I followed him, grabbing a golf club near the entryway of the garage. He grabbed an old baseball bat from the corner, threw the cackling walkie-talkies against the concrete floor, and began to smash them. We smashed the devices repeatedly until the laughter had fizzled out. By the time that we were done, all there was left of the walkie-talkies were crunched up pieces of yellow metal. Breathing heavily, I gingerly approached the mangled walkie-talkies and gave them a nudge with my foot. No more audio emitted from either device. Ernie collapsed on the ground, shoulders heaving from the adrenaline rushing through his veins. "That never happened when we were younger," he said. "It didn't, no." We paused to catch our breath and collect our thoughts. Too many weird things had been happening lately for me to be fazed, but Ernie didn't know about that. Any chance that could have been an elaborate prank? If it was, it'd be a blessing. "And what do you think happened to Harold?" Ernie asked tentatively. "I don't want to think about what happened to Harold," I declared. I didn't want to live with the fact that I probably heard a man's last words before he was mauled by whatever creature he was stuck in the woods with, and the fact that his wife and kid, if they really existed, probably thought that he had just disappeared this entire time. I groaned, rubbing my face in my palms. "I need an exorcist, and I need to get all of this stuff out of my garage before Gina kills me." If Gina wasn't enough motivation to go through all of my dumpster finds, this was definitely a strong contender. "Or before that thing on the other end finds you," Ernie pointed out, and I rolled my eyes. "And would you look at that?" he said, showing me the full bars on his cell screen. "Phone service is back." Cece was mad, of course. When she woke up that morning, she immediately began to interrogate me about the walkie-talkies. Ernie left early for work, so I was left to deal with her questions. I wished that I could have just told her the truth, but there was no way I was scarring my daughter's imagination like that. She refused to eat her cereal and only settled for a piece of toast after being prompted to do so by Gina. I tried explaining to her that the walkie-talkies were defective and didn't work anymore, but ultimately, her reasoning for her anger made me glad that we had destroyed the walkie-talkies on the spot. "George was telling me to play hide and seek with him tomorrow, and now I can't anymore,"